I was sitting in my living room in Boulder, Colorado, watching the Weather Channel predict the worst blizzard we had seen in 15 years when I heard the first knock on my door. It was February, and the wind was already howling through the trees outside my modest two-story home in the Meadowbrook Hills subdivision. I had just moved here 6 months ago after landing a job as an IT consultant for a tech startup downtown, and I was still getting used to the quirks of suburban life after spending most of my 20s in apartments. The knock came again, more insistent this time. I got up from the couch, pausing the weather report, and walked to the front door. Through the peephole, I could see a woman in her mid-50s standing on my porch, her blonde hair styled in that signature speak-to-the-manager cut, wearing a puffy white jacket that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. She was holding a clipboard and had the kind of expression on her face that immediately told me this was not going to be a pleasant interaction. I opened the door and immediately felt the bite of the cold air rushing in. "Can I help you?" "Are you Marcus Hendricks?" she asked, not bothering with any pleasantries. "I am, and you are." "Susan Kensington, president of the Meadowbrook Hills Homeowners Association. I need to speak with you about several violations you've committed regarding the community guidelines." I blinked at her, confused. Violations? I just moved in 6 months ago. Nobody said anything to me about any problems. Susan flipped through the papers on her clipboard with the efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. "First, your truck. That oversized vehicle parked in your driveway is in clear violation of Section 7, Subsection 3 of the HOA bylaws, which states that no commercial vehicles or trucks exceeding 3/4-ton capacity may be parked in visible areas of the property." I glanced over at my Ford F-250, a truck I had bought specifically for Colorado winters and occasional camping trips. "That's not a commercial vehicle, that's my personal truck." "It's oversized and unsightly," Susan said, her voice dripping with condescension. "It brings down the property values of the entire neighborhood. Second, your holiday decorations. You were required to remove all Christmas lights by January 15th. It's now February 8th, and I can still see lights hanging from your gutters." I felt my jaw tighten. "I've been waiting for a warmer day to get up there safely. We've had ice storms for the past 3 weeks. That's not my problem, Mr. Hendricks. The rules apply to everyone equally. Third, your lawn. Even though it's winter, you need to maintain proper edging along your driveway and walkway. The grass has grown over the concrete in several places." "The grass is dormant and covered in snow half the time," I said, my patience wearing thin. Susan gave me a tight smile that did not reach her eyes. "Rules are rules. I'm issuing you 3 formal violations. You have 14 days to rectify all issues, or you'll be fined $500 per violation. Additionally, I'm placing your truck on notice. If it's not removed from your driveway within 7 days, it will be towed at your expense." "You can't tow my truck from my own property," I said, incredulous. "Actually, according to the HOA agreement you signed when you purchased this home, we can. I suggest you read through your paperwork more carefully, Mr. Hendricks. Good day." She turned on her heel and walked back down my driveway, her expensive boots clicking against the concrete. I stood there in the doorway, cold air rushing past me, absolutely stunned by what had just happened. I had heard horror stories about HOAs before, but I had thought they were exaggerated. The real estate agent who sold me the house had assured me that the Meadowbrook Hills HOA was very reasonable and barely noticeable. That was clearly a lie. I closed the door and immediately went to my office to dig through the boxes of paperwork from the home purchase. After 20 minutes of searching, I found the HOA bylaws, a document that was nearly 100 pages long and written in the kind of dense legal language that made my head hurt. I started reading through it, and my heart sank with every page. The rules were extensive and covered everything from the color you could paint your mailbox to the exact species of flowers you were allowed to plant in your front yard. The truck rule was indeed in there, though it seemed deliberately vague about what constituted a commercial vehicle. My F-250 was definitely over the 3/4-ton limit, but it was also a completely standard personal truck that thousands of people in Colorado drove every single day. The Christmas light rule was there too, along with dozens of other arbitrary deadlines and restrictions that seemed designed more to give the HOA board power over residents than to actually maintain any reasonable community standards. I spent the next hour fuming and researching. I looked up Susan Kensington online and found out that she had been the HOA president for 7 years and had a reputation in the neighborhood for being absolutely ruthless about enforcement. There were forum posts from other residents complaining about her, but they were all anonymous, probably out of fear of retaliation. One person claimed she had forced them to repaint their entire house because the shade of beige they had chosen was 2 shades too dark according to the approved color palette. Another said she had fined them repeatedly for having their trash cans visible from the street, even though trash day was the only time they were outside. I realized I was dealing with someone who took an absurd amount of joy in controlling other people's lives. The next day, I called the HOA management company to file a formal complaint about Susan's behavior and to request a hearing about the violations. The woman who answered the phone sounded tired and apologetic. "Sir, I understand your frustration, but Mrs. Kensington has the authority to issue violations based on her interpretation of the bylaws. If you want to dispute them, you'll need to attend the next board meeting, which is scheduled for March 15th. "That's over a month away," I said. She gave me 7 days to move my truck or it gets towed. "I'm sorry, sir. That's the process. You can submit a written appeal, but it will still need to be reviewed at the next meeting." I hung up, feeling trapped. I spent the rest of the day trying to figure out what to do. I could move my truck to a storage facility, but that would cost money and be incredibly inconvenient, especially with the blizzard coming. I could risk leaving it in my driveway and see if Susan actually followed through on her threat to have it towed. Or I could try to find some way to fight back against this petty tyrant, who seemed to have nothing better to do than make my life miserable. That evening, I decided to do something I probably should have done when I first moved in. I installed security cameras around my property. I had been meaning to do it anyway for general security purposes, but now I had an additional motivation. If Susan was going to be watching my every move, I was going to make sure I had evidence of any harassment or unreasonable behavior on her part. I installed 4 cameras, one covering the front door and driveway, one on the side of the house covering the backyard entrance, one covering the back porch, and one inside my garage pointing out toward the driveway. They were high-definition cameras with night vision and motion detection, connected to a cloud storage system so that all footage would be automatically backed up. I spent a few hours setting everything up and testing it, making sure the angles were right and the motion sensors were properly calibrated. As I was finishing up, I noticed Susan walking past my house on the sidewalk, her phone pressed to her ear. She glanced at my truck, then at my house, with an expression of pure disdain. I watched her through the window, and I had the distinct feeling that this was not going to be the end of our conflict. The blizzard hit 2 days later, on February 10th. The weather reports had been accurate for once. Snow started falling around noon and did not stop for the next 36 hours. By the time it was over, we had received 28 inches of snow, with drifts piling up to 4 feet in some places. The entire city of Boulder essentially shut down. Roads were impassable, Schools and businesses closed, and even the snowplows could not keep up with the accumulation. I spent the first day of the blizzard inside, working remotely and watching the snow pile up outside my windows. My truck was completely buried in the driveway, covered in a thick layer of white. I was not worried about it. The F-250 was built for this kind of weather, and once the roads were cleared, I would dig it out and be perfectly fine. On the second night of the blizzard, around 2 in the morning, I was woken up by a notification on my phone. The security camera system had detected motion in my driveway. Half asleep, I grabbed my phone and pulled up the camera feed, expecting to see a deer or maybe a neighbor's dog wandering around in the snow. Instead, I saw Susan Kensington. She was trudging through the knee-deep snow in my driveway, wearing dark clothing and carrying what looked like a large bottle in her hands. I sat up in bed, suddenly wide awake, and watched in disbelief as she approached my truck. The camera's night vision mode cast everything in shades of black and white, but the footage was crystal clear. Susan looked around, checking to see if anyone was watching, then unscrewed the cap on the bottle and started pouring liquid all over the hood of my truck. She moved methodically, splashing the liquid across the front of the vehicle, down the sides, and across the windshield. Even in the grainy night vision footage, I could see the liquid was lighter in color than water, and when it hit the snow around my truck, it seemed to foam slightly. My heart was pounding as I watched. What the hell was she doing? After she had emptied the entire bottle, Susan dropped it in the snow near my mailbox, then turned and trudged back through the snow toward the street. I watched her disappear from the camera's view, heading in the direction of her own house 3 doors down. I immediately got out of bed and ran to my front window. I could not see much through the falling snow, but I could make out the dark shape of my truck in the driveway and what looked like discolored patches across its surface. I grabbed a flashlight and my winter coat, shoved my feet into boots, and went outside. The cold hit me like a physical blow. The wind was still howling, driving snow into my face as I made my way down the driveway. When I reached my truck and shined the flashlight on it, my stomach dropped. The paint was bubbling and peeling in long streaks across the hood, the roof, and down both sides. Wherever Susan had poured that liquid, the paint was being eaten away, revealing the bare metal underneath. I touched one of the spots carefully and immediately smelled the sharp, chemical odor of bleach. She had poured bleach all over my truck. I stood there in the blizzard, snow piling up around me, staring at the damage and feeling a surge of anger so intense I could barely think straight. This was not just vandalism. This was malicious destruction of property. Susan had deliberately come to my house in the middle of a blizzard and destroyed my vehicle because she was angry about me not following her petty rules. I bent down and found the bottle she had dropped. It was a large commercial-size container of industrial-strength bleach, the kind used for heavy-duty cleaning. I picked it up carefully by the edges, not wanting to contaminate any fingerprints, and carried it back to my garage. Once I was inside, I went back to my phone and saved the security footage, downloading it to multiple locations including my laptop, an external hard drive, and sending a copy to my personal email. I watched the footage 3 more times, making absolutely sure I had not misunderstood what I was seeing. But there was no mistake. The footage clearly showed Susan approaching my truck, pouring bleach all over it, and then leaving. I did not sleep for the rest of the night. I sat in my living room, looking at the footage and trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to march down to Susan's house right then and confront her, but I knew that would be stupid. I needed to handle this the right way through proper legal channels. This was not just an HOA dispute anymore. This was a crime. As soon as it was a reasonable hour, around 7 in the morning, I called the Boulder Police Department's non-emergency line. I explained the situation to the dispatcher, who sounded skeptical at first but became more interested when I mentioned I had clear video footage of the incident. "Sir, given the weather conditions, we're responding to emergencies only right now," the dispatcher said. "But this does sound like criminal mischief at minimum. I'm going to create a report and have an officer contact you as soon as possible, probably within the next 24 to 48 hours once the roads are passable." "That's fine," I said. "I have all the evidence saved. It's not going anywhere." After I hung up with the police, I called my insurance company. That conversation was more frustrating. The claims adjuster told me that vandalism was covered under my comprehensive insurance, but I would have to pay my $1,000 deductible, and they would need to send an inspector out to assess the damage before they could approve any repairs. Given the blizzard, that probably would not happen for several days at minimum. Then I did something I probably should have done earlier. I took extensive photos of my truck from every angle, documenting all the damage the bleach had caused. The paint was ruined. What had been a clean, well-maintained forest green F250 now looked like it had some kind of disease, with long streaks of bare metal showing through where the paint had been chemically burned away. I estimated the repair costs would be in the thousands of dollars, possibly requiring a complete repaint of the entire vehicle. The blizzard finally ended that afternoon, and the city slowly started to dig itself out. Snowplows worked through the night, and by the next morning the main roads were passable, though side streets like mine were still pretty rough. I spent a few hours shoveling my driveway and clearing a path to my front door, and I noticed several neighbors doing the same. A few of them glanced at my truck and the obvious damage, but nobody said anything to me. Around 2 in the afternoon, a Boulder police patrol car pulled up in front of my house. An officer got out, a woman in her 30s with dark hair pulled back in a tight bun. She introduced herself as Officer Jennifer Martinez and asked if I was Marcus Hendricks. "That's me," I said, shaking her gloved hand. "I understand you have video footage of someone vandalizing your vehicle during the blizzard." "I do. Come inside and I'll show you everything." Officer Martinez followed me into my house, stamping snow off her boots at the door. I led her to my office and pulled up the security footage on my computer. I played it for her from start to finish, and I watched her expression change from professional interest to serious concern as she saw Susan pouring bleach all over my truck. "Do you know who this person is?" Officer Martinez asked. "Her name is Susan Kensington. She's the president of our homeowners association. She came to my door a few days before this happened and threatened to have my truck towed because she said it violated HOA rules. She was pretty angry about it." Officer Martinez made notes on a small pad she had pulled from her jacket pocket. "And you have this footage saved in multiple locations?" "Yes, I can email you a copy right now if you want." "Please do. I'm also going to need you to show me the damage to your vehicle and provide any other evidence you have." I took her outside and showed her my truck. Even in daylight, the damage looked even worse than it had at night. The bleach had eaten through the paint in long, irregular streaks, and there were spots where the metal was already starting to show signs of rust from exposure to the snow and moisture. Then I showed her the bleach bottle I had recovered, which I had stored in a plastic bag in my garage. Officer Martinez looked at it carefully but did not touch it. "I'll need to take this as evidence," she said. "We'll dust it for fingerprints. Can you show me exactly where you found it?" I led her to the spot near my mailbox where Susan had dropped the bottle. There was still a depression in the snow where it had been, even though more snow had fallen since then. Officer Martinez took more photos and measurements, then went back to her patrol car and made some calls on her radio. After about 10 minutes, she came back to where I was standing on my front porch. "Mr. Hendricks, based on the evidence you've provided, I'm going to file charges against Susan Kensington for criminal mischief in the second degree, which is a Class 2 misdemeanor in Colorado. Given the amount of damage to your vehicle, the district attorney might choose to elevate the charges. Someone will be in touch with you within the next few days to get a formal statement. In the meantime, I'm going to go have a conversation with Miss Kensington. Thank you, officer. I have to tell you, in 15 years of police work, I've seen a lot of HOA disputes, but this is definitely one of the most blatant cases of vandalism I've encountered. Most people aren't dumb enough to do something like this while being recorded. I almost laughed at that. I don't think she knew I had cameras. I just installed them a few days ago. Officer Martinez smiled slightly. Well, that was good timing on your part. I'll be in touch. I watched her drive down the street toward Susan's house, and I felt a grim sense of satisfaction. Susan had thought she could intimidate me and destroy my property without consequences. She was about to learn otherwise. I went back inside and tried to focus on work, but I kept glancing at my phone, waiting for updates. About an hour later, I heard raised voices outside. I looked out my window and saw Officer Martinez standing on Susan's front porch, and Susan herself was in the doorway, gesturing wildly and clearly shouting, though I could not make out the words from this distance. The conversation went on for about 15 minutes. At one point, Susan tried to close the door, but Officer Martinez said something that made her stop. Eventually, Susan seemed to deflate, and Officer Martinez handed her some papers before walking back to her patrol car and driving away. My phone rang almost immediately. It was a number I did not recognize, but I answered anyway. "Is this Marcus Hendricks?" a woman's voice asked, shrill and angry. "Who's calling?" "You know exactly who this is." "How dare you call the police on me? Do you have any idea what you've done? I am the president of this HOA, and I will make your life a living hell." "Susan, if you're calling to threaten me, I'm recording this conversation, and I will provide it to the police as evidence of harassment." There was a moment of silence, then the line went dead. I immediately called Officer Martinez and left her a voicemail explaining that Susan had just called me with what sounded like threats. She called me back within an hour and told me she would add that information to the report and that I should not have any further direct contact with Susan. The next few days were surreal. Word spread through the neighborhood about what had happened, and I suddenly found myself the subject of intense gossip. Some neighbors stopped by to express their support and share their own horror stories about Susan and the HOA. One couple, the Johnsons, who lived 2 houses down, told me that Susan had fined them 6 times in 1 year for various minor infractions, and they were considering moving just to get away from her. "She's made this neighborhood miserable," Mrs. Johnson said, sitting in my living room with a cup of coffee. "But nobody's ever really stood up to her before because she's so vindictive. If you cross her, she'll find every possible violation she can and make your life hell." "Well, she crossed a line this time," I said. "What she did was a crime, not just a petty HOA dispute, Mr." Johnson nodded. "We're glad someone's finally holding her accountable. A bunch of us have been talking, and we're planning to attend the next HOA meeting to call for a vote of no confidence in her leadership." That made me feel a little better. At least I was not alone in this. My insurance adjuster came out 2 days later, took one look at my truck, and whistled low. "That's some serious damage. Bleach will absolutely destroy automotive paint. You're looking at a full repaint, minimum $5,000 to $6,000, possibly more if there's any rust damage to the metal underneath." The adjuster took photos and measurements, then told me my claim was approved and I could take the truck to any certified body shop for repairs. The problem was that with my $1,000 deductible, I was still going to be out a significant amount of money, and my insurance rates would probably go up as a result of the claim. About a week after the incident, I received a call from the Boulder County District Attorney's office. A prosecutor named Daniel Ramirez wanted to meet with me to discuss the case against Susan Kensington. I drove downtown to the DA's office on a cold, clear morning and was shown into a small conference room where Ramirez was waiting. He was a man in his 40s, wearing a crisp suit and tie with wire-rimmed glasses and a no-nonsense demeanor. He shook my hand and got right to business. "Mr. Hendricks, I've reviewed the evidence in your case, including the security footage and the police report from Officer Martinez. I want you to know that we're taking this very seriously. Miss Kensington's actions constitute clear criminal mischief, and given the dollar amount of the damage to your vehicle, we're elevating the charges to criminal mischief in the first degree, which is a Class 3 misdemeanor, potentially escalating to a Class 1 misdemeanor depending on the final damage assessment." "What does that mean in terms of potential penalties?" I asked. "If convicted on the highest charge, Miss Kensington could face up to 18 months in county jail and fines up to $5,000. However, these cases often result in plea bargains." "I wanted to talk to you about what outcome you're hoping for." I thought about that for a moment. "Honestly, I want her to face real consequences for what she did. She can't just destroy people's property because she's on a power trip with the HOA. I also want restitution for the full cost of repairs to my truck, not just what insurance doesn't cover." Ramirez nodded, making notes. "That's reasonable. I should tell you that Miss Kensington has already retained an attorney and they've indicated she intends to fight the charges. Her position is apparently that she was trying to clean your truck during the blizzard and didn't realize bleach would damage the paint." I stared at him. "That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Who goes to someone else's house at 2 in the morning during a blizzard to clean their truck without permission? And who wouldn't know that bleach damages car paint?" I agree it's not a credible defense, which is why we're moving forward with prosecution. But I wanted you to be aware that this might go to trial, which means you'll need to testify. I'm ready to do that. Good, we'll be in touch as the case progresses. In the meantime, avoid any contact with Miss Kensington and document any further harassment. Over the next few weeks, the legal process ground forward slowly. Susan was formally arraigned and pleaded not guilty to all charges. Her attorney filed several motions trying to get the security footage excluded as evidence, arguing that I had violated her privacy by recording her without consent. The judge rejected those motions, pointing out that there was no reasonable expectation of privacy in someone else's driveway, especially while committing a crime. During this time, the HOA situation got even more complicated. Susan refused to step down as president, even as more residents began speaking out against her. The March board meeting turned into a 3-hour shouting match, with dozens of homeowners showing up to air their grievances. I attended and gave a brief statement about what had happened, showing photos of my damaged truck. The board voted to place Susan on temporary administrative leave pending the outcome of the criminal case, and they appointed an interim president, a retired accountant named Thomas Chen, who seemed much more reasonable. One of his first acts was to announce that the HOA would be conducting a full review of all bylaws and enforcement procedures to make sure they were fair and reasonable. Thomas also personally apologized to me for what had happened and told me the HOA would be suspending all violations that Susan had issued against me pending the review. That was a relief, though the damage to my truck was still a constant reminder of the incident every time I looked at it. The body shop estimated it would take 3 weeks to properly repair all the damage. In the meantime, I was driving a rental car paid for by my insurance, and my truck sat in the shop, stripped down to bare metal in several places as they prepared to repaint it. As spring arrived and the snow finally melted, The case against Susan moved toward trial. The DA's office made several attempts to negotiate a plea deal, but Susan's attorney kept rejecting them, insisting that the charges should be dropped entirely. Ramirez told me that Susan seemed to believe she was untouchable because of her position with the HOA, and that she genuinely thought she had done nothing wrong. "She's living in a fantasy world," Ramirez said during one of our phone conversations. "The evidence against her is overwhelming. No jury is going to believe she was just trying to be helpful at 2 in the morning during a blizzard." The trial was scheduled for late April. As the date approached, I found myself getting nervous. I had never testified in court before, and the idea of being cross-examined by Susan's attorney was intimidating. Ramirez assured me that I would do fine, and that all I needed to do was tell the truth about what happened. The trial took place in Boulder County Court over 3 days. The courtroom was smaller than I had expected, with wooden benches and fluorescent lighting that gave everything a slightly sterile feeling. Susan sat at the defense table with her attorney, a sharp-dressed man named Richard Blackwell, who looked like he charged $500 an hour. She kept her eyes straight ahead and never looked at me. The prosecution's case was straightforward. Ramirez called Officer Martinez to testify about responding to my report and collecting evidence. He showed the jury the security footage, which was played on a large screen at the front of the courtroom. I watched the jurors' faces as they saw Susan trudging through the snow and pouring bleach all over my truck. Several of them looked shocked and disgusted. Then it was my turn to testify. Ramirez walked me through the whole story, from Susan's initial visit to my house threatening to tow my truck, to installing the security cameras, to discovering the damage the morning after the blizzard. I explained how much the repairs had cost, and how the incident had impacted my life. When Blackwell cross-examined me, he tried to suggest that I had a personal vendetta against Susan, and that I might have damaged my own truck to frame her. It was absurd, and Ramirez objected multiple times. The judge sustained most of his objections. "Mr. Hendricks, isn't it true that you were angry about the HOA violations Miss Kensington issued to you?" Blackwell asked. "I was frustrated, yes, but I didn't vandalize my own truck. That makes no sense. You installed security cameras shortly before this alleged incident. Doesn't that seem like suspicious timing?" "I installed them because Susan had been harassing me, and I wanted to document any future problems. It turned out to be a good decision." Blackwell tried a few more lines of questioning, but nothing he said seemed to land with the jury. The security footage was just too clear and damning. The defense's case was weak. Susan took the stand and stuck to her ridiculous story that she had been trying to help clean my truck during the blizzard, because she thought ice and salt might damage the paint. When Ramirez cross-examined her, he tore her story apart. "Miss Kensington, you claim you were trying to help Mr. Hendricks by cleaning his truck. Did you ask his permission?" "No, I thought I would surprise him," Susan said, her voice tight. "At 2 in the morning, during a blizzard. I couldn't sleep, and I saw his truck was covered in snow. And you decided the best way to clean it was with industrial-strength bleach. I thought it would cut through the grime. Miss Kensington, do you own a vehicle?" "Yes." "Have you ever used bleach to clean it?" Susan hesitated. "No, but Have you ever cleaned anyone else's vehicle at 2 in the morning without their permission?" "No." "Did you know that bleach damages automotive paint?" I wasn't thinking clearly. "But you were thinking clearly enough to walk 3 houses down in knee-deep snow during a blizzard, carrying a large bottle of bleach, to clean a truck belonging to someone you had threatened to have towed just days earlier." Susan did not have a good answer for that. Her attorney tried to rehabilitate her testimony on redirect, but the damage was done. The jury clearly did not believe her. The trial concluded on the 3rd day with closing arguments. Ramirez methodically laid out all the evidence and pointed out the absurdity of Susan's defense. Blackwell tried to create reasonable doubt by suggesting that maybe Susan really had meant well and just made a terrible mistake, but it fell flat. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts: criminal mischief in the first degree and criminal trespass. Susan's face went pale when the verdict was read, and she gripped the edge of the defense table like she might pass out. Sentencing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. During that time, Ramirez told me the DA's office would be recommending significant jail time because Susan had shown no remorse and had continued to maintain her innocence despite overwhelming evidence. They would also be asking for full restitution to cover my truck repairs and other expenses. The sentencing hearing was much shorter than the trial. The judge, a stern woman named Patricia Goldstein, listened to statements from both sides. Ramirez argued that Susan's actions were premeditated and malicious, and that she had abused her position of authority in the HOA to target someone she viewed as a troublemaker. He pointed out that several other residents had come forward with stories of harassment by Susan, showing a pattern of behavior. Blackwell argued for leniency, claiming that Susan was a pillar of the community who had served the HOA for years, and that this was an aberration. He asked for probation and community service instead of jail time. I was allowed to make a victim impact statement. I stood up and addressed the judge directly. "Your Honor, what Susan Kensington did to me was not just about property damage. It was about power and control. She thought she could destroy my truck because I didn't follow her rules, and she thought she would get away with it. If I hadn't had security cameras, I would have had no way to prove what she did, and she would still be out there harassing other residents. The $6,000 in damage to my truck is significant, but the bigger issue is that someone in a position of authority in our community thought it was acceptable to commit a crime to punish someone she disagreed with. That's not how a civil society works." Judge Goldstein listened carefully, then took a few moments to review her notes before speaking. "Miss Kensington, I've presided over many cases involving homeowners association disputes, and I've seen how these conflicts can escalate. However, what you did crosses a clear line from civil dispute into criminal conduct. You deliberately vandalized Mr. Hendricks's vehicle in a premeditated act of retaliation. Your continued insistence that you were trying to help him is not credible and suggests you lack genuine remorse for your actions. The security footage clearly shows you knew exactly what you were doing." The judge paused, then continued. "I'm sentencing you to 16 months in Boulder County Jail with credit for time served. You will also pay full restitution to Mr. Hendricks in the amount of $6,200 for vehicle repairs, plus an additional $800 for his insurance deductible and rental car expenses. You will be placed on probation for 2 years following your release, during which time you will have no contact with Mr. Hendricks and will not serve in any capacity with any homeowners association. Do you understand?" Susan's face crumbled and she started crying. Her attorney put a hand on her shoulder, but she shook it off. "This isn't fair. I dedicated years to that community." "I was just trying to maintain property values." Judge Goldstein's expression hardened. "Miss Kensington, you vandalized someone's vehicle because you disagreed with what kind of truck they drove. That is not dedication to your community. That is criminal behavior. This court is adjourned." The bailiff led Susan away, still crying and protesting. I sat there for a moment, feeling a strange mix of relief and sadness. I had wanted justice, and I had gotten it, but seeing someone actually go to jail was sobering, even someone who had wronged me as badly as Susan had. After the sentencing, Ramirez shook my hand in the courthouse hallway. "Congratulations, Mr. Hendricks. 16 months is a significant sentence for this type of crime." The judge clearly took this seriously. "Thank you for everything you did," I said. "I know it was just another case for you, but it meant a lot to me." "Actually, this one was personal," Ramirez said with a slight smile. "I live in an HOA community too, and I've dealt with my share of petty tyrants. It felt good to hold one accountable for once." The aftermath of the case played out over the following months. The HOA went through with its promised review of bylaws and enforcement procedures, and Thomas Chen led a complete overhaul of how violations were handled. The new system included clear appeal processes, multiple warnings before fines could be issued, and limits on what types of vehicles and decorations could be restricted. The truck rule that Susan had tried to enforce against me was eliminated entirely. Several other residents who had been fined or harassed by Susan filed civil suits against both her and the HOA seeking damages. The HOA's insurance ended up settling most of those cases, and the whole mess cost the association over $100,000 in legal fees and payouts. It was a harsh lesson about the dangers of letting one person accumulate too much unchecked power. My truck was eventually fully repaired and looked as good as new. The body shop did excellent work, and you could not tell there had ever been any damage unless you knew where to look. I kept it parked proudly in my driveway, and nobody ever said another word about it. I did receive Susan's restitution payment, though it came in installments over several months as she apparently had to sell assets to pay what she owed me. I used the money to upgrade my security camera system and add a few more cameras around my property. I also donated a portion to a local legal aid organization that helps homeowners fight back against abusive HOAs. Susan served her full 16-month sentence. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she tried to get early release for good behavior, but was denied because she continued to maintain her innocence and insisted she had been railroaded by a corrupt system. After her release, she moved out of Colorado entirely. Someone told me she went to live with relatives in Arizona, though I never bothered to verify that. I was just glad she was gone. The Meadowbrook Hills HOA eventually found its footing again under new leadership. Thomas Chen served as president for 2 years before stepping down, and the community elected a younger couple, the Patels, to take over. They brought fresh energy and a more collaborative approach to neighborhood management. The community became a much more pleasant place to live, with residents actually talking to each other and working together instead of living in fear of arbitrary enforcement actions. I settled into my life in Boulder, enjoying my job and my home. I made friends with several neighbors who had supported me during the ordeal, and we occasionally got together for barbecues and game nights. The Johnsons became particularly close friends, and Mr. Johnson and I started a tradition of going hiking together in the nearby mountains every few weeks. Looking back on the whole experience, I realized that standing up to Susan had been one of the most stressful things I had ever done, but also one of the most important. It would have been easier to just move my truck and comply with her unreasonable demands, to keep my head down and avoid conflict. But sometimes you have to fight back against bullies, even when it is hard and scary and uncertain. The security footage had been the key to everything. Without it, the case would have been my word against Susan's, and there was a good chance nothing would have happened. She would have continued her reign of terror over the neighborhood, and I would have been out $6,000 with no recourse. The cameras had cost me a few $100s to install, but they had ultimately saved me thousands and helped bring a criminal to justice. I also learned a lot about HOAs and how they work. The fundamental problem with many HOAs is that they attract people who crave power and control, but have no real outlet for those desires in their professional or personal lives. Someone like Susan can do enormous damage when given unchecked authority over something as important as where people live. The key is having strong oversight mechanisms, clear rules about enforcement, and a community that is willing to speak up when things go wrong. About a year after Susan's sentencing, I was working in my home office when I got an unexpected email. It was from a journalist who wrote about HOA issues for a national real estate website. She had heard about my case and wanted to interview me for an article about HOA abuses and how residents can protect themselves. I agreed to the interview, and we talked for over an hour about everything that had happened. She was particularly interested in the role that security cameras had played in documenting Susan's crime and holding her accountable. The article came out a few weeks later under the headline, "How Security Footage Sent an HOA President to Jail." It went viral in the world of HOA reform advocates, and I started getting emails and messages from people all over the country who had their own horror stories about abusive HOA boards. Some of those stories made what Susan had done to me look tame by comparison. I heard from people who had been fined tens of thousands of dollars for minor violations, who had lost their homes to HOA foreclosures over unpaid dues, who had been harassed and bullied by board members wielding their small amount of power like tyrants. The sheer volume of complaints made me realize that Susan was not an anomaly. She was part of a much larger systemic problem with how HOAs operate in America. I started doing more research into HOA reform efforts and discovered there were organizations working to change state laws to provide better protections for homeowners. I reached out to some of these groups and shared my story, and I even testified before a Colorado legislative committee that was considering new HOA regulations. I talked about my experience and urged the lawmakers to pass stronger oversight requirements and clearer penalties for board members who abuse their authority. The bill eventually passed, and Colorado became one of the first states to require HOA board members to undergo training in fair housing laws and proper enforcement procedures. It was not a perfect solution, but it was a step in the right direction. Through all of this, my life gradually returned to normal. The notoriety from the case faded, and I was once again just another resident of Meadowbrook Hills, going to work, maintaining my home, and enjoying the Colorado lifestyle that had attracted me to Boulder in the first place. But I never forgot what had happened, and I never took for granted the importance of standing up for yourself when someone tries to push you around. One warm evening in early summer, about 2 years after the blizzard incident, I was sitting on my back porch with a beer, watching the sun set over the mountains. The Johnsons came over with their dog, and we sat together talking about nothing in particular. At some point, Mr. Johnson mentioned that he had driven past the house where Susan used to live, and there was a new family moving in. "Young couple with a baby," he said. "They seem nice. I hope they enjoy the neighborhood more than Susan did. I hope we're a better neighborhood for them than we were capable of being when Susan was in charge," I said. Mrs. Johnson nodded. We learned a lot from that whole mess. About speaking up, about not letting one person control everything, about actually caring for our community instead of just following arbitrary rules. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, and I thought about how much had changed in 2 years. The neighborhood was genuinely better now. People looked out for each other. The HOA functioned as it was supposed to, handling necessary maintenance and community issues without harassing residents over petty nonsense. And I had my truck, fully repaired and parked in my driveway, a quiet symbol of the fact that sometimes justice actually does prevail. My phone buzzed with a notification from my security camera system, just a routine motion detection from a neighbor's cat walking across my yard. I glanced at it and smiled. Those cameras had turned out to be one of the best investments I had ever made, not just because they had caught Susan in the act, but because they gave me peace of mind. I knew that if anything ever happened on my property again, I would have evidence. I would have proof, and that made all the difference. As the evening wore on, and my neighbors eventually headed home, I stayed outside a little longer, enjoying the cool air and the quiet. I thought about everything that had happened, from that first knock on my door when Susan came to threaten me about HOA violations, to watching her get led away in handcuffs after sentencing. It had been a long, difficult journey, but I had come through it stronger and more confident in my ability to stand up for myself. The bleach stains on my truck were long gone, repaired by skilled technicians who had carefully restored every inch of damaged paint. But the memory of that morning when I discovered what Susan had done, standing in the snow and staring at my ruined vehicle, was still fresh in my mind. It was a reminder that some people will go to shocking lengths to exert control over others, and that vigilance and evidence are your best defenses against such behavior. I finished my beer and went inside, locking the door behind me. The security camera monitors in my office showed quiet views of my property, everything peaceful and undisturbed. Tomorrow I would go to work, come home, maybe do some yard work or catch up on household projects. Life would continue on, normal and uneventful, exactly the way I liked it. But I would never again take that normalcy for granted. I had learned that your home is your castle, and sometimes you have to fight to defend it, not with physical force but with evidence, with persistence, and with a refusal to be intimidated by petty tyrants who think their small amount of authority gives them the right to run other people's lives. Susan Kensington had thrown bleach on my truck during a blizzard, thinking she would get away with it. Instead, the security footage I had wisely installed sent her to jail for 16 months. Justice had been served, the neighborhood had been freed from her tyranny, and I had learned valuable lessons about standing up for yourself and documenting everything. As I settled into bed that night, I felt genuinely at peace. The ordeal was over. The bad guy had faced consequences. And life in Meadowbrook Hills had become what it should have been all along. A community of neighbors living peacefully together, without fear of harassment or arbitrary rules enforced by someone on a power trip. My truck sat safely in the driveway, unmarked and unbothered. The cameras watched over my property. And somewhere, Susan was living with the consequences of her actions, hopefully learning that you cannot destroy other people's property just because you disagree with their choices. It was over, truly over, and I could finally move forward without looking over my shoulder. The blizzard had brought unexpected challenges, but I had weathered the storm in more ways than one. And on the other side of it, I had found a stronger sense of self, a better community, and the satisfaction of knowing that sometimes, when you stand up to a bully with evidence and persistence, justice actually wins.